My HOA threatened to steal my house over a 12-foot sunroom. They slapped a lien on my front door and gave me 30 days to demolish it, but they didn't read the fine print on my deed. My backyard wasn't HOA property. It was a federally protected Native American sanctuary. The sunroom smelled like fresh cedar and dried paint. It was a simple 12 by 12 box of glass and wood, bolted to the back of our house, overlooking a steep drop-off into a thick tangle of woods. I built it for Clara. Clara's world had been shrinking for 3 years. The multiple sclerosis took her balance first, then her stamina, and finally, her tolerance for the blistering summer heat of the valley. She used to spend hours in the garden, up to her elbows in dark soil. Now she spent her days in a padded recliner, watching the seasons change through a living room window that was always just a little too dusty. I framed the sunroom myself on the weekends. I pulled the permits from the city. I paid the fees. I drove the nails. For 3 months, I sweated through my shirts so Clara could have a place to sit among her potted ferns without the heat triggering a flare-up. We got exactly 2 weeks of peace. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen pouring iced tea. Clara was in her chair in the new sunroom, a book resting in her lap, her eyes closed as the afternoon light washed over her face. She looked relaxed. Her hands weren't trembling. Then I heard the high-pitched electric whine of a golf cart. I looked out the front window. Diane was parallel, parked across my driveway. Diane was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. She was a woman who wielded a clipboard like a loaded weapon. She wore sensible shoes, pressed khaki capris, and a perpetual expression of mild disgust, as if the entire neighborhood smelled faintly of rotting trash. I watched her march up my driveway. She didn't come to the front door. Instead, she unlatched the side gate and let herself into my backyard. I set down the pitcher. The ice clinked sharply against the glass. I walked out the back door just as Diane produced a yellow retractable measuring tape from her pocket. "Can I help you, Diane?" She didn't look up. She pressed the metal tab of the tape against the corner of the new sunroom and walked backward, the tape zipping out with a metallic rasp. "You didn't submit an architectural variance request, Thaddeus," she said. Her voice was flat, administrative. "I didn't need to," I replied, crossing my arms. "I pulled the city permits. The addition doesn't extend past the original footprint of the patio." "City permits are irrelevant." Diane snapped the tape measure back into its housing. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet yard. Article 4, Section 12 of the bylaws. Any external modification requires a physical inspection and written approval from the board. You didn't ask. Therefore, this structure is illegal. "It's a sunroom, Diane, for my wife. You can't even see it from the street." "Rules are rules." She clicked her pen. "You have 14 days to dismantle it." She tore a pink slip off her clipboard and slapped it onto the glass of the new sunroom. It stuck there, an ugly, fluorescent stain against the cedar frame. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't look at Clara, who was watching us through the glass, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, the tremor back in her fingers. I peeled the pink slip off the window. It wasn't just a warning, it was a fine, $250. I crumpled it in my fist. I told myself it was a scare tactic. Just petty suburban bureaucracy. I'd go to the board meeting, explain the situation, maybe pay a late filing fee, and it would blow over. I was wrong. The board meeting was a kangaroo court held in the fluorescent-lit basement of the community clubhouse. Diane sat in the center of a folding table, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they were just happy to be included. I brought pictures. I brought my city permits. I brought a letter from Clara's doctor explaining her condition. Diane didn't look at any of it. "The board has voted," Diane said, staring at a spot on the wall just above my head. "The structure is out of compliance with the neighborhood aesthetic. The roof pitch is wrong. The materials were not pre-approved. The fine is now accumulating at $50 a day. If it is not removed by the end of the month, we will hire a demolition crew and bill you for the labor." "You can't touch my house," I said. My voice shook, not from fear but from a sudden blinding rage. "It's my property." Diane smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. "When you bought the house, Thaddeus, you signed the deed restrictions. You agreed to abide by the covenant. We can, and we will." The fines piled up. They arrived in the mail every 3 days, crisp, white envelopes that felt heavy with malice. $50 a day became $100. $500 turned into $2,000. The sunroom, which was supposed to be Clara's sanctuary, became a monument to our anxiety. Clara stopped sitting out there. She said the smell of the cedar made her nauseous now. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, doing the math. We didn't have the money to fight a protracted legal battle. Clara's medical bills ate up my salary. The savings were gone. Then, on a rainy Thursday, the final letter arrived. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm. It was a notice of intent to foreclose. Because of the unpaid fines, the HOA had placed a lien on our house. They were going to take our home over a 12-foot glass box. Panic is a physical thing. It tastes like copper. It sits right behind your ribs, tight and heavy, making every breath feel like you're drawing air through a wet sponge. I sat at the kitchen table with the foreclosure notice. The legal jargon blurred together. Foreclosure sale, eviction, auctions. Clara wheeled into the kitchen. She saw the paper. She saw my face. She didn't ask what it was. She just reached out and put her hand over mine. Her skin was cool. "We'll take it down," she said quietly. "Tommy, it's okay. I don't need the room. Just tear it down." "I'm not tearing it down." The words came out harsher than I intended. I softened my voice. "I'm not letting them win. There has to be a mistake, a loophole, something." I took the day off work. I drove downtown to the county records building. It was a brutalist concrete block from the 1970s, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I didn't know what I was looking for. A flaw in the HOA's incorporation documents, a zoning error, anything. The archives department was in the basement. It was run by a guy named Stan, who had tufts of white hair sticking out from behind his ears and a pair of reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. "Whispering Pines," Stan muttered, typing with 2 rigid index fingers into a keyboard that looked older than I was. "Built in '98. Developer went bankrupt halfway through Phase 3. Nasty business." "I just need my property lines," I said. "The original plat map, the deed restrictions, everything attached to my lot." Stan sighed, pushed his chair back, and disappeared into a labyrinth of rolling metal shells. He came back 10 minutes later, carrying a cardboard tube. He unscrewed the cap and rolled a heavy yellowed sheet of architectural paper onto the counter, weighing the corners down with a stapler and a tape dispenser. It was the master survey of the neighborhood from before the first shovel of dirt was turned. "Okay, here's your cul-de-sac," Stan pointed with a thick finger. "Lot 42, that's you." I leaned in. I traced the black lines marking my property. The front yard, the footprint of the house, the backyard. But my backyard didn't look right. In my physical yard, there was the patio, the new sunroom, a stretch of grass, and then a chain-link fence that separated my property from the dense, overgrown woods that sloped down into a ravine. On the map, my property line ended exactly 5 feet past the back wall of my house. Beyond that line, encompassing the space where I had built the sunroom, the patch of grass, and the fence itself, was a shaded area marked with heavy, diagonal hash marks. "What is this?" I pointed at the shaded section. "Why is my lot cut in half?" Stan frowned. He adjusted his glasses. He leaned closer to the paper, squinting at the tiny faded text printed inside the shaded box. "Oh well, I'll be damned," Stan whispered. "What?" Stan turned around and went back to his computer. He typed faster this time. He pulled up a digital county map, overlaid it with modern satellite imagery, and then superimposed the zoning layers. He spun the monitor around to face me. "The developer of your neighborhood never owned that slice of your backyard," Stan said, pointing a pen at the screen. "See this red line? That's the boundary of Whispering Pines. The HOA's jurisdiction ends there. The red line sliced right across my patio. Then who owns the rest of my yard? I asked. The federal government, Stan said, looking at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. More specifically, the Department of the Interior. It's an easement. An easement for what? Stan clicked another button. A scanned document from 1932 popped up. Back in the 30s, a survey team found a cluster of indigenous burial mounds down in that ravine. The local tribal authority petitioned the government. The feds stepped in and carved out a protection zone. Not only are the mounds protected, but the whole upper ridge, which happens to be your backyard, is classified as a buffer zone. It's a designated sanctuary for a federally endangered plant that grows near the mounds. I stared at him. The copper taste in my mouth vanished, replaced by a sudden electric rush of adrenaline. Are you telling me, I said slowly, that my sunroom is built on federal land? Technically, yes, Stan said. The previous owner must have put up that chain-link fence illegally to claim the yard. The HOA just assumed it was part of the neighborhood plot. So, I'm squatting on a federal Native American sanctuary. Yep. Will the feds make me tear the sunroom down? Stan shook his head. Nah. The law from 32 says existing structures are grandfathered, and since the footprint was just a concrete patio that's been there since '98, they won't care about a glass box sitting on top of it. The Bureau of Land Management is underfunded. As long as you aren't digging up the ground and disturbing the artifacts or the flora, they won't bother you. I looked back at the screen, the beautiful, glowing red line. Stan, I said, a grin slowly spreading across my face. Does the HOA have any legal authority over federal land? Stan barked a laugh. Are you kidding? If the HOA touches a blade of grass on that side of the line, they're committing a federal crime. Tampering with a protected heritage sanctuary carries a massive fine. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars and prison time. I didn't walk out of the records building, I floated. Diane and her board hadn't just overstepped. They had placed a lien on my house for refusing to alter federal property. They were demanding in writing that I commit a federal crime by demolishing a structure on protected native land. And I had all their demands signed, dated, and delivered on official HOA letterhead. I got into my car. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to a lawyer, not a cheap strip mall attorney. I went to a firm downtown that specialized in land use and federal litigation. I dropped the foreclosure notice, the HOA fines, and the stamped county survey maps onto the mahogany desk of an attorney named Robert. Robert listened to my story. He looked at the fines. He looked at the map. Then he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Thaddeus, Robert said softly, we are going to ruin these people. Robert didn't just want to win. He wanted to dismantle the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association down to its studs. He spent 2 hours explaining the intricate web of federal land management, the Antiquities Act of 1906, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The legal reality was devastatingly simple. The HOA was demanding that I destroy a structure sitting on a federally protected archaeological and ecological buffer zone by issuing fines and putting a lien on my house to force that demolition. They were engaging in extortion to compel a federal crime. If they actually send a crew to tear it down, Robert said, tapping a gold pen against his legal pad, they cross the line from a civil nuisance into federal criminal trespass and destruction of protected heritage property. The fines for that don't come in $50 increments, Thaddeus. They come in the hundreds of thousands, and they come with prison time. So what do we do? I asked. Call them and explain. Absolutely not, Robert said, his eyes hard. You never interrupt an opponent while they are making a fatal mistake. We send them a standard cease and desist. We tell them the property is under federal jurisdiction. We don't explain the details. Diane will assume it's a bluff. People like her always do. Her ego won't allow her to back down. I drove home. The neighborhood looked different to me now. The perfectly manicured lawns, the uniform mailboxes, the sterile sweeping curves of the sidewalks. It all felt like a fragile film. Stretched over a massive, unyielding bedrock, they thought they owned the earth. They just painted the surface. I found Clara in the living room. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes. She was holding a framed photograph of us from our honeymoon, her fingers trembling so badly the glass was rattling against the cardboard. My heart broke in my chest. "Clara, what are you doing?" I knelt beside her, putting my hands over hers to steady the shaking. "We're losing the house, Tommy," she whispered. Her voice was thin, exhausted. "The foreclosure notice. The deadline is Friday. I thought I should start packing the small things." I took the photograph from her hands and set it aside. I pulled her into my arms. She felt so frail, her bones sharp against my chest. The anger I felt toward Diane, toward the entire petty, miserable board, solidified into something cold and heavy. "We aren't going anywhere," I said into her hair. "I went to the county. I found a lawyer. Clara, the sunroom isn't on HOA land. It's on a federal sanctuary. They can't touch it. They can't touch the house." She pulled back, looking at me with wide, confused eyes. I explained the maps. I explained Stan and the basement archive. I explained Robert and the trap we were setting. For the first time in weeks, the tight, pinched lines of pain and anxiety around Clara's mouth began to smooth out. She let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "They really can't tear it down?" she asked. "If they try," I said, "they'll be answering to the federal government." The next week was a master class in bureaucratic silence. Robert sent the cease and desist. He cited the specific federal statutes. He CC'd the local field office of the Bureau of Land Management and the regional director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Diane's response arrived via email 48 hours later. It was dripping with condescension. She called my legal notice a desperate, fabricated delay tactic. She stated that the board had reviewed the subdivision plat, ignoring the actual county master deed, of course, and reconfirmed their authority. The final sentence made my pulse hammer in my ears. "The deadline remains Friday at 8 a.m. As you have refused to comply, the Whispering Pines HOA has contracted a private demolition firm to dismantle the unauthorized structure. The cost of $3,400 will be added to your outstanding lien." She was actually going to do it. I forwarded the email to Robert. He replied 3 minutes later. "Checkmate. I'll see you Friday at 7:30 a.m. Keep Clara inside." Thursday night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustle through the trees in the ravine. The woods felt different now. Older, heavier. They weren't just a backdrop to my suburban life anymore. They were a boundary line, a fortress. Friday morning broke gray and humid. A thick fog clung to the ground, turning the neighborhood into a damp, muted ghost town. At 7:15 a.m., Robert pulled into my driveway in a sleek silver sedan. He stepped out wearing a sharp navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked entirely out of place in the sleepy suburban morning. At 7:45 a.m., the heavy diesel rumble of a commercial truck shattered the quiet. A white, heavy-duty pickup hauling a flatbed trailer turned onto our street. Strapped to the trailer was a yellow skid steer loader with a demolition grapple attached to the front. Behind the truck, a familiar silver golf cart buzzed along the asphalt. Diane had arrived to watch the execution. I stood on the driveway. Robert stood beside me, his hands casually in his pockets. The demolition truck parked against the curb. A burly guy in a high-visibility vest hopped out. He carried a heavy metal toolbox and a crowbar. He looked bored. This was just another job to him. Diane parked her golf cart right on the edge of my grass. She stepped out, her clipboard clutched to her chest. She wore a smug, victorious smile that made my stomach churn. 2 other board members lingered in the golf cart behind her, eager spectators to my humiliation. "Good morning, Thaddeus," Diane called out. Her voice echoed in the damp air. "I see you haven't removed your belongings from the structure. The crew will have to drag them out onto the lawn. You'll be billed for the extra labor." "Diane," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I'm telling you, for the absolute final time, do not step foot in my backyard. Do not touch that sunroom." Diane rolled her eyes. She turned to the contractor. Go ahead, Jim. Round the back. Take the fence down first so you can get the machinery through. Jim nodded. He hoisted the crowbar onto his shoulder and started walking up my driveway. Jim, was it? Robert stepped forward. His voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly over the rumble of the idling diesel truck. Before you take another step, I highly recommend you look at who you're taking orders from, because if you cross that gate, you're going to lose your commercial license and go to federal prison. Jim stopped. He lowered the crowbar. He looked at Robert's expensive suit, then at Diane. Look, lady, I don't want any domestic disputes. I just have a work order. He's lying, Diane snapped, her face flushing angry red. He's just trying to scare you. The HOA has a legal lien on this property. We have the right to abate the violation, tear down the fence. Jim hesitated, but he took another step toward the gate. He didn't make it. Tires screeched at the end of the cul-de-sac. Two black SUVs, caked in mud and sporting heavy push bars on the front bumpers, tore down the street. They didn't park neatly at the curb. They swerved and blocked the demolition truck perfectly, boxing it in. The doors flew open. 4 men stepped out. They weren't local police. They wore olive green tactical pants, heavy boots, and dark jackets with bright yellow lettering on the back. Federal Agent, Department of the Interior. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard, walked straight up the driveway, his eyes locked onto Diane. Are you the individual who contracted this demolition? The agent's voice was a low, authoritative bark. Diane took a step back. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Yes. I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. We are executing a lawful— Stop talking, the agent interrupted. He didn't yell, but the sheer force of his tone made Diane flinch. He turned to the contractor. Kill the engine on that truck. Drop the tools. If you move that heavy machinery 1 inch closer to this property, I will seize it as evidence in a federal felony investigation. Jim dropped the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the concrete. He practically sprinted to his truck to shut off the engine. Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. For felony. This is an HOA matter. This man built an illegal sunroom. Robert stepped forward, opening his briefcase. He handed a thick stack of papers to the federal agent. Good morning, Robert Vance, legal counsel for the homeowner. As discussed on the phone, here is the original 1932 land patent, the verified county survey lines, and the cease and desist order we provided to the HOA, which they explicitly ignored. The agent scanned the paperwork. He looked past my house, toward the backyard, and then back to Diane. Ma'am, the agent said, stepping closer to Diane. The property line of this subdivision ends at the foundation of that patio. Everything beyond it, including the land underneath that sunroom, is a federally designated archaeological buffer zone. It is protected under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It is federal property. Diane shook her head frantically. No, that's impossible. Your deed restrictions end where federal jurisdiction begins. The agent cut her off. You ordered a private company to bring heavy demolition equipment onto a protected indigenous heritage site. You instructed them to destroy a grandfathered structure on federal land. That is a violation of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. I didn't know, Diane shrieked. The 2 board members in the golf cart were desperately trying to start the electric engine to flee, but in their panic, they had jammed the key. Ignorance is not a defense, especially when you were served written legal notice 48 hours ago, the agent said. He pulled a heavy sealed envelope from his jacket and shoved it against Diane's chest. She had to grab it or let it fall to the ground. What is this? Diane whispered, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. That is a federal injunction, the agent said, and a notice of pending criminal charges. The Department of Justice will be in contact regarding the attempted destruction of protected federal land. I suggest you retain federal defense counsel immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. There was no more barking from Diane, No more quoting of Article 4, Section 12 of the bylaws. The petty tyrant of Whispering Pines had finally run into a wall she couldn't find, bully, or tow away. She looked at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that I recognized. It was the exact same terror Clara had felt staring at the foreclosure notice. Diane turned around, stumbled back to her golf cart, and drove away. She didn't look back. The contractor packed up his truck in record time and sped out of the neighborhood, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. The agent stayed for another hour, walking the property line with Robert, verifying the original survey markers buried in the brush. They assured me that the sunroom, resting on the old concrete, wasn't doing any harm to the deep soil where the actual artifacts were protected. I was the unofficial, accidental steward of the land. The fallout was swift and brutal. The federal government didn't mess around. The fines levied against the HOA for the attempted tampering and the extortion of federal land use were catastrophic. They totaled nearly $400,000. The HOA's insurance explicitly refused to cover criminal acts or federal fines caused by board negligence. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association went completely bankrupt within 6 months. The board was dissolved. Diane stepped down in disgrace, sold her house at a loss, and moved out of state before the federal prosecutor could finalize the plea deal that kept her out of a minimum security prison. Without an HOA, the lien on my house evaporated. The foreclosure was dismissed with prejudice. Summer eventually faded into a crisp, cool autumn. The leaves in the ravine turned brilliant shades of gold and deep, burning red. I walked out to the sunroom one afternoon. Clara was sitting in her recliner. She wasn't wearing a sweater, despite the chill outside. The glass held the warmth of the afternoon sun perfectly. She had a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was just looking out at the woods, her face relaxed, her hands perfectly still. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea, walked into the room, and sat down next to her. She smiled, took the glass, and leaned her head against my shoulder. No fines in the mail, no clipboards at the door, just the quiet rustle of the ancient woods and a 12 by 12 glass room that belonged to absolutely no one but us. And that is how a petty HOA president's obsession with a 12-foot sunroom ended up costing her aboard their power, their money, and almost their freedom. Sometimes, the finest print is the only thing standing between you and disaster. If you enjoyed this story of malicious compliance and federal loopholes, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this with anyone who hates their HOA, and subscribe for more stories where the little guy actually wins. See you next time.